The steward's voice filled the council chamber the way smoke fills a room with no windows, slowly at first, then all at once, until there was nothing else. She is an ill omen, my king. The borderland settlements say she walked into the plague dark and did not die. That is not a thing a natural woman does. Turn her from the gate and send her south before the sickness rides in on her heels. I was standing at the long table with my back to him, looking out at the courtyard below. Snow was coming down in the lazy, sideways way it does just before it decides to become serious about itself. The outer gate had been opened a crack. I could see the line of torchlight that meant the gatekeepers were dealing with something, and I had the clear, unreasonable thought that whatever they were dealing with, it could wait while I finished staring at the snow. Aldrich had been speaking for 10 minutes. He had a talent for filling 10 minutes with the same point dressed in different clothes. "You have made your concern known," I said without turning, "twice. With respect, my king. 3 times now." Behind me, the other council members were doing what they always did when Aldrich and I disagreed, going very quiet and studying the grain of the table, as if it contained the answers to questions they had not thought to ask. "She is a healer," I said. "There is a second outbreak moving through the lower settlements. We have 40 wolves in the infirmary and more arriving from the border camps by the hour. She has been working the borderlands for the past 3 years treating this same sickness. If you would rather we turn away the one person in the kingdom who has been inside this plague and come out the other side, you are welcome to walk down to the infirmary yourself and explain that to the 40 wolves who are not coming out the other side." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the table-studying silence. It had a shape to it. "Send her to the East Annex," I said. "She sleeps warm, she eats, and in the morning she speaks to our healers. After that, if she wishes to leave, she may leave." I turned from the window. Aldrich's face was arranged into the expression I had come to think of as his official portrait, dignified displeasure, held at a careful remove from anything that could be called insubordination. "As you command," he said. I dismissed the council and went downstairs alone. The woman was still standing in the outer courtyard when I came through the great doors, and I stopped at the top of the steps because the snow had indeed made good on its promise. It was coming down in earnest now, and she was standing in it with the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to expect shelter and has therefore stopped wanting it. She was slight, dressed in layers of oiled wool the color of river mud, hood up, pack slung across one shoulder, a healer's satchel across the other. The gatekeeper was talking to her. She was listening without moving her head, the way a person listens when the words being spoken are not new to them and they are only waiting for them to be finished. I do not know what I expected. Something more dramatic, perhaps. A woman who had survived 3 years in the plague-dark borderlands ought to have arrived trailing some evidence of the fact. What I saw instead was someone who had simply been walking for a long time and had, at last, run out of road. She turned then, not toward me, but toward the torchlight from the gate as the keeper finally stepped back, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was perhaps 25, brown-skinned, dark-eyed, the kind of stillness in her features that is not coldness but the careful arrangement of someone who has learned to hold their feelings where the wind cannot reach them. There was a cut along her left cheekbone, fresh from a branch or a fall. She had not tended it. Something happened in my chest just then, not dramatic, nothing like the songs describe, a warmth only. Like a coal I had believed long cold, shifting beneath the ash to remind me it was still there. I had no name for it. I filed it away under the heading of the long day and went down the steps. She saw me coming and did not step back or bow. She watched me with those still, dark eyes, measuring, waiting. "You're the healer from Duskfen," I said. "I am." Her voice was low and even, not deferential, not bold, simply honest, the way people who have spent a long time alone sometimes speak, as though they have forgotten to calibrate for an audience. I had word there was a second outbreak moving through the fortress settlements. I have spent 3 winters with this sickness. I thought I might be useful. You came alone. There was no one to come with me. There was no self-pity in that. It was simply true, and she said it the way she said everything else plainly, with no performance attached to it. You'll sleep in the East Annex tonight, I said. Tomorrow morning you'll speak to my head healer. If your methods and your knowledge are sound, we'll discuss a longer arrangement. She looked at me for a moment that was 2 beats longer than necessary. Then she nodded once. Thank you, she said, and that was all. I had the distinct impression that she had expected to be turned away and was not quite certain what to do with the fact that she had not been. That impression stayed with me through dinner and into the evening, long after the snow had buried the courtyard, and the fortress had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a house that is holding its breath. Her name was Saren. I learned this from my head healer, Marin, the following morning, after Marin had spent 2 hours with her, and came to find me with an expression I had not seen on her face in some time, a mixture of relief and something close to wonder. She knows this illness better than any healer I have spoken to, Marin said. Not from books, from having been inside it. She can tell me which of the 40 will turn the corner tonight and which 3 I should sit with now. She knows the herbs by their smell in the dark, my king. She has been doing this alone, with whatever she could find in the borderland forests for 3 years. Where was she before the borderlands? A village called Ashlow, due east of Duskfen. The first outbreak took it. She was the only survivor. The first outbreak. That had been 4 years ago, when the sickness had moved through the eastern settlements like fire through dry grass, and we had lost an entire village to it before we understood what we were dealing with. She survived that, I said. She did more than survive it. From what she has told me, she spent the first 6 months treating the dying, and then, when there was no one left, she walked back into the sickness herself to understand it. She is not entirely sure why she did not die. She thinks it may be that she was exposed so many times that her body stopped fighting and simply learned to live with it. I thought about this for a moment, and the council's concern that she carries the sickness. Marin's expression sharpened. My king. A person who has survived a thing that kills everyone else is not carrying it. She is the only one in this kingdom who is not afraid of it. She paused. She is also not afraid of much else, as far as I can tell. She asked me this morning if she could begin in the infirmary after breakfast. And I said yes, of course, and she put down her cup and went. I went to the infirmary myself that afternoon, not to observe her, or so I told myself, but because there were 3 wolves in the East Wing who had not responded to any treatment, and I had been going in the evenings to sit with them for a few minutes. An alpha goes where his pack is. That is not sentiment. It is simply what the role requires. I found her at the bedside of Garen, who was one of our oldest pack warriors and who had been losing ground for 4 days. She was sitting on the low stool beside him with his hand between both of hers, not doing anything I could name, not applying poultice, not speaking medicine, not tending a wound. Simply sitting with him, her head bowed slightly, her breathing slow and deliberate, as though she was lending him the tempo of her own steadiness. Garen was asleep. His color was better. I stood in the doorway for a moment too long because she heard me. I made no sound, but she turned her head and looked at me the way she had looked at me the night before, measuring, steady, no flicker of anything she did not intend. He was afraid, she said, very quietly so as not to wake him. Not of dying, of it being meaningless. I stayed with him until the fear moved through. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was the honest response. She turned back to Garen. I stood in the doorway for another moment, that coal in my chest pressing warmly against my sternum, and then I went away. My daughter found her on the 3rd day. I should tell you about Lyra before I tell you what happened, because without understanding what Lyra had been, The weight of what she did would not make sense to you. She was 6 years old. She had been, before her mother died, one of those children who are always slightly ahead of the word in their mouth, the thought racing forward, the body trying to catch up, so that she was forever half laughing at something she had seen before anyone else had turned to look. She had been loud in the joyful way of children who have not yet been taught to moderate themselves. She had woken each morning as though morning were a personal accomplishment. Her mother had died 2 years and 9 months ago. 14 days after that, Lyra had stopped speaking. Not from an injury, not from illness. The healers had looked and listened and found nothing wrong with her voice. She simply stopped. The words went somewhere inside her that no one could reach, and she sealed them there. And for almost 3 years she had moved through Ashenvale like a small, silent ghost, communicating in glances and gestures, never meeting anyone's eyes for long enough to have a conversation. The healers said it was grief. The council said it was grief. My own wolf, deep and quiet, said it was grief. I had tried everything I knew to try. I had sat with her in the evenings and told her about her mother, the sound of her laugh, the particular way she had moved her hands when she was thinking, the morning she had stood in this very courtyard in the snow and caught flakes on her tongue and dared me to tell her it was undignified. I had told Lyra all of it, every detail I could find and hold on to, and she had listened with those still dark eyes that were her mother's eyes and her own eyes both, and she had not spoken. I had stopped expecting her to speak. I had learned to love the version of her that was here, and to wait, without hoping, for the version of her that was lost. On the 3rd morning of Saren's presence in Ashenvale, I came to the infirmary to find that Lyra was already there. She should not have been. The infirmary was not a place for children, and she knew this. But the door had been left unlatched, and Lyra had a long history of finding unlatched doors and a philosophical relationship with the concept of rules that applied to her specifically. I found her standing just inside the entrance, still in her nightdress and fur-trimmed overdress, her dark hair loose and tangled from sleep, watching Saren work. Saren was at the far end of the ward, changing the dressing on the shoulder wound of one of the border wolves. She had not noticed Lyra, or perhaps she had, and had decided that noticing would frighten the child away. Lyra was utterly still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Her usual stillness was the stillness of a child who has gone far inside herself. This was the stillness of a child who is riveted. I was about to go to Lyra and take her back to her chamber when Saren finished with the dressing and turned, and she and Lyra looked at each other across the length of the infirmary. Neither of them moved. Saren's expression did something then that I had not seen it do in the days since she had arrived. It opened, only slightly, in the way a door opens when the latch is lifted before anyone has decided to push. She set down her cloth and her basin and straightened, and she did not go to Lyra. She simply waited. Lyra took a step toward her, and then another. It took her a long time to cross the infirmary because she was not crossing the distance between two people. She was crossing something else, something that had no name I knew, and it required care. Saren waited the whole time without moving, without beckoning, without doing anything except being there. When Lyra was close enough, she reached out and took hold of the hem of Saren's apron, which was perhaps the smallest possible way to touch someone, and she looked up. Saren looked down. The warmth behind my sternum became, for just a moment, something almost unbearable, not painful, but full, the way a room is full when it is finally, after a long cold season, warm all the way to the edges. I stayed in the doorway. I did not trust myself to go in. From that morning on, Lyra followed her. Not constantly, not clinging, but with the steady, purposeful attention of someone who has found something they recognize and intend to keep close until they understand what it is. She would appear at the infirmary door in the mornings and sit on the bench near the window while Saren worked, small feet swinging, watching with the same riveted stillness. She began helping, handing Saren the things she pointed to, holding a basin, carrying the clean cloth from the shelf. She was serious about it, the way children are serious about things they have decided matter. Saren spoke to her, not in the falsely bright way some adults speak to children, loud and simplified, as though the child is a smaller and less intelligent type of person. She spoke to her the way she spoke to everyone, honestly, with the words in the right order, trusting Lyra to follow. She told her what she was doing and why. She asked her opinions, and when Lyra answered with a gesture or a look, she responded as though the answer had been spoken aloud. I watched this every day for a week, and every day the warmth in my chest pressed a little deeper, a little more specifically, in a way I could no longer file away under the heading of the long day. I had been unmated for 3 years. My wife, Riona, had died in the first wave of the sickness, 3 months before it reached Ashlow, before anyone understood yet what it was. I had been the last alpha in the Northern Territories to close our borders, because I had not wanted to believe it was as serious as the early reports suggested, and by the time I understood that it was already in the fortress. I had held Riona's hand on the 6th day when she was past waking, and told her things I will not tell you now. She had died on the 7th. After that there had been Lyra, who needed me. After that there had been the pack, who needed me. After that there had been the slow, necessary work of rebuilding, of managing what we had lost, of learning to be a king who was also a man with a hollowed-out room where something essential had been. I had not looked at another woman in 3 years. I had not expected to. I told myself, watching Saren move through my infirmary with the quiet assurance of someone who has been inside the worst thing and come back from it with their gentleness intact, that what I was feeling was gratitude. Gratitude, and the relief of watching a skilled healer work. Nothing more than that. I was lying to myself, and I knew it, and I told myself the lie again anyway, because the truth of the thing was too large to look at directly. On the 8th day, Aldrich came to my solar. My king. He sat across the table from me with his hands folded and his portrait face in place. I have consulted with the other council members, the healer from the borderlands. Her work in the infirmary is acknowledged. We are grateful for her skills in this difficult time. I hear a however approaching, I said. However, he smoothed the front of his robe. The sickness is turning. 7 of the 40 have been cleared to return to their quarters. The others are on the right path. We anticipate, if the healer's predictions hold, a full recovery of the remaining wolves within the fortnight. Her predictions have been correct on every wolf she has spoken about so far. Yes, my king, she was brought here as a temporary measure. Her work is nearly complete. It would be appropriate to compensate her generously for her service and see her return to the borderlands. I set down the report I was holding. The borderlands. Or wherever she chooses to settle, we would provide an escort naturally. Alone. A small, careful pause. There is no indication that she requires. She is a woman alone who has been living in the plague dark for 3 years, I said. She arrived here with a cut on her face she had not bothered to tend, and a pack that weighed less than my hunting cloak. You want to send her back to that. She has survived it admirably, my king. I looked at him for a long moment. Aldrich was not a cruel man. That was the complicated thing about him. He was a cautious man, and caution in a council member is a virtue and a problem in equal measure, because a cautious man will always weigh risk against sentiment and conclude, correctly, that sentiment has no weight on a scale. And he was not wrong that there was risk. A woman who had survived the beyond, who had walked through a thing that killed everyone she knew and come out the other side. There were people in this pack who would never fully trust that. There would always be those who said the word omen in a low voice when she passed. I knew that. I also knew that I had no intention of sending her back to the borderlands. The decision is mine, I said. I will consider it. Aldrich nodded once and left. I sat at my desk for a long time after, with the warmth in my chest and the truth of the thing that I could not yet look at directly, and I thought about what it would mean to offer her something more than a grateful escort to the gate. I had not yet done anything about what I was feeling. I had held it carefully at arm's length because I was not certain what to do with it, and because the shape of it was still forming, and also because there was the question of whether she felt anything at all. She was polite to me. She was honest. She never flinched away. But she was polite and honest and steady with everyone, and I did not know how to tell the difference between the way she treated me and the way she treated the world in general. I knew only that she was the first person in 3 years who had been able to reach my daughter, and I knew that the warmth in my chest had nothing to do with gratitude. I went to the infirmary that evening as usual. Lyra was there, sitting on her bench, watching Saren measure powders into small cloth packets and fold the tops down and label each one with a mark. She had developed a system for labeling that used symbols rather than words: a circle for the fever reducer, a star for the breathwork powder, a small crescent for the one that helped with sleep. She had taught the symbols to Marin and the other healers, and now they used them too. Lyra was watching this with great concentration. As I came in, she looked up, registered me with a small nod, and returned to watching. "She has been here since the afternoon meal," Saren said, without looking up. "She helped me resort the entire south shelf. She is thorough." "She comes by it naturally," I said, sitting in the chair beside the door. "Her mother was the most organized person I have ever known." Saren looked up then. Her eyes met mine across the infirmary, and something passed between us. Not a word, not a touch, something quieter than that. An acknowledgement. She knew about Riona the way everyone in the fortress knew, because a king's grief is not a private thing. And she understood, I thought, because grief was not a foreign country to her. She looked back down at her packets. "She has her mother's hands," she said, "long-fingered, good for careful work." I looked at Lyra's hands, folded in her lap. I had not noticed before how much they looked like Riona's. Something tightened in my throat. "Yes," I said, "she does." We sat in a comfortable silence after that, me in the chair, Saren at the bench, Lyra between us in the way that children occupy the space between adults when they have decided that adults are allowed to be near each other. When the evening bell rang, Saren set down her last packet and looked at Lyra. "Time for your supper," she said. Lyra looked at her, then she looked at me. Then she slid off her bench, went to Saren, and pressed her face briefly against Saren's arm, just for a moment, a small purposeful movement, before she turned and walked toward the door where I was waiting. I picked her up. She put her arms around my neck and settled against me with the practiced ease of 3 years of being carried, and we went out into the corridor. Behind me, I heard Saren begin to hum something, very softly, as she put away the last of her packets. I did not know the song. It sounded like something from the borderlands, something old, something that had been sung in a language that had mostly been forgotten but left its melody behind. That night I lay awake for a long time. 2 days later, Aldrich returned with the expulsion order written out. I had been expecting it. He had been expecting that I would sign it. What neither of us had been expecting was what happened when I asked him, quite reasonably, to give me until the end of the week, until the last of the 40 were cleared, before I made any final decision about her continued presence. Aldrich set the parchment on my desk and smoothed it flat with his palm in the way that meant the matter was, as far as he was concerned, decided. "My king, the sickness is under control. Every day she remains, there will be questions from the pack about her status here. Is she a guest? A member of the healer's contingent?" He paused with a careful delicacy that I found irritating. "The pack needs clarity." "The pack," I said, "has 40 wolves who are alive because she arrived when she did. I have not heard many questions from those wolves. There are others who are less pragmatic." I looked at the parchment. It was written in Aldrich's careful, slightly too large script, the script of a man who writes as though he expects his documents to be read by posterity. Her name was at the top, as a heading, Saren of Duskfen, Borderland Healer, followed by the polite, bureaucratic language of an official expulsion. In gratitude for services rendered, wish to ensure her safe departure. The escort will be provided at the king's expense. Asterisk. I did not pick up the pen. I will consider it, I said for the second time. Aldrich left again with the portrait face. I did not see her that evening. I had a meeting with the border commanders that ran long, and by the time it was done and I came to the infirmary, the corridor was dark and quiet, and the only light was the one that Marin kept burning through the night for the wolves who were still recovering. Saren was not there. I found her, eventually, in the courtyard at the north end of the fortress, the one that faces the mountains. She was standing in the snow with her coat on and her hood down, which was either very brave or very foolish, looking up at the sky. It was clear that night, bitterly cold, the stars hard and bright in the way they get in deep winter when there is no moisture in the air to soften them. I stood in the archway for a moment before she heard me, because I am not always as quiet as I intend to be. I keep forgetting how many there are, she said, still looking up. In the borderlands the trees are too close. You can only see a strip at a time. A pause. I slept outside for a long time. The last month before I came here, when the supply runner's cabin flooded and I hadn't built a proper shelter yet. It was colder than this, but the sky was like this. I went and stood beside her and looked up. The mountains were black against the stars. The snow on their lower flanks caught enough moonlight to glow faintly, a pale blue-white that had no warmth in it but was beautiful for that very reason. Aldrich brought the order this morning, I said. A short silence. I know. Marin told me. Another pause. I expected it. Did you? I have been turned from places before. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness would have been. I understand the reasoning. I walked through a thing that killed everyone. People like to believe that the ones who survive are different from everyone else, but not in a good way. It is easier to send me south than to look at me every morning and wonder why I'm still here when their people aren't. That is a generous interpretation. It's the true one. She turned her head and looked at me. The moonlight was on her face, sharp and clear, and I could see that she had finally tended the cut on her cheekbone. It was healing cleanly now. I am not angry at them. I stopped being angry at things I can't change quite a long time ago. The warmth in my chest was doing something it had not done before. It was pressing outward, not just against my sternum but in all directions, as though, whatever the coal was, it had been lit properly now, and was not content to simply remind me of itself anymore. Where will you go? I asked, because I could not yet say what I wanted to say. She considered. There is another settlement 3 days southwest. Marin said there were cases there. I can be useful there. You are useful here. For now, she looked back at the stars. The sick recover, and then the useful thing moves on. That is not what I meant. She turned to look at me again, and this time she did not look away. I should have said it cleanly. I had been king for 10 years. I had negotiated treaties and ended border disputes, and managed the particular complexity of a pack that had been through loss, and had come out the other side still needing to be led forward. I knew how to say difficult things with precision and without hedging. What I said instead was, I don't want you to go. It was not elegant. It was simply true, and I suppose at some point the true thing is the only thing left. She was very still for a moment. The stars were behind her, and the snow was around her feet, and she looked, in the moonlight, like someone who had been standing in a cold field waiting for something for a very long time, and was not certain, yet, whether what had arrived was really what she had been waiting for. My king, she began. Caden, I said, here now, not in the hall, Caden. A pause. Caden. She said my name carefully, the way you say a word in a language you are just beginning to learn, testing the shape of it. I do not know what I am to you. I came here as a healer. I have been careful to remain that. I know. I have been a breath. I have been careful because I do not have a great deal left to lose, and I have learned, very carefully, not to want things that are likely to be taken from me. I understood that. I understood it the way you understand a thing that is also true of yourself. I am not asking you to want anything tonight, I said. I am asking you to stay until the end of the fortnight, until every wolf is cleared. And then I would like to ask you to stay longer, and I would like, if you are willing to do that properly, to ask you, as a man asks, not as a king commands. She was quiet for a long moment. The snow fell gently, just a little, as though it had changed its mind about stopping. The end of the fortnight, she said finally. Yes. All right, a breath, all right. I did not touch her. This was not the moment for it, and besides, she had held herself carefully at a distance from wanting things, and I was not going to take anything she had not offered. I simply stood beside her in the courtyard for a little while longer, and we looked at the stars together, and the coal in my chest burned with a steadiness that had nothing urgent in it, just warmth, just certainty. The way a fire feels when you have finally, after a long time, built it properly. In the morning, I found Aldrich's parchment on my desk where I had left it, and put it in the drawer. That was the morning I stopped lying to myself. I did not announce this to anyone. I simply stopped filing the warmth away under the wrong heading and let it be what it was, a recognition, of the oldest and most ungovernable kind, that did not require my permission and had not been waiting for it. I told my wolf, which had known since the courtyard. It settled further. I did not tell Saren. Not yet, because there is a way that things can be ruined by being named before they are ready, and what was growing between us was fragile in the way that all genuine things are fragile, not because it was weak, but because it was real. Real things require care. I had learned this from loss. So I kept the knowledge privately and went about my days, and watched what was growing with the patient attention of a man who has come to understand that not everything worth having arrives in a single decisive moment. Some things arrive the way spring arrives, a degree at a time, a day at a time, each one slightly longer and warmer than the last, until one morning you look around and the snow has gone without you noticing the exact moment it left. What I noticed in those days was the specific texture of the thing. It was in the way she moved through the fortress, not tentatively, as a guest moves, or performatively, as someone seeking approval moves, but with the quiet authority of a person who is present in a place without needing the place to validate them. She walked the corridors as though she had decided they were navigable, and they were, and that was sufficient. She sat at the dinner table without looking around to see whether her presence was welcome. She simply sat, and was, and the warmth of that, of watching someone inhabit a space that they had not been certain they would be allowed to inhabit, was something I had no previous name for. I found names for it slowly, over those days. Belonging, that was one name. Coming home, for a person who had been a long time without one. She and I had fallen into a habit in those evenings of sitting together in the small hall after dinner while Lyra drew. We had not explicitly arranged this. It had simply begun happening, the way habits form, out of the accumulation of days in which it was the natural thing to do. We would sit on opposite sides of the low table near the fire, she on the old settle with her map or her healer's notes, I with whatever correspondence I had carried in from the day, and we would work in a silence that was not empty. It was the silence of two people who have discovered that they do not need to fill the space between them. Sometimes she asked me things. She was curious about the history of the pack, about the decisions that had shaped Ashenvale over the generations before me, about the territories to the east and what relations we had with the packs beyond the mountain pass. She asked the way she asked everything directly, with attention, treating the answer as something that mattered to her. I found that I liked being asked. I had been for 3 years the person who asked others things and carried the answers alone. Being asked in return was unexpectedly restorative. She told me, one evening, about the village of Ashlow before the sickness came. It had been a border village, she said, a minor place. About 100 wolves and perhaps 40 human families who had been there since before the pack was formed, and who had been woven into the pack's life slowly over generations, so that the distinction between pack and non-pack had become less a wall and more a gradual shading from one kind of belonging to another. Her father had been a healer. Her mother had kept the records, births, deaths, the seasonal accounts that tracked the harvest and the trade with the eastern settlements. She was very good at numbers, Saren said. She could look at a column of figures and find the mistake without touching a pen. She used to say that numbers tell stories, you only have to learn how to read them. A pause. I never learned that particular skill. I learned the plants. Who taught you? My father. He had a saying that the forest provides if you ask it the right questions. She looked at her hands, the long healer's fingers. I spent a great deal of time asking it questions, the first winter in the borderlands, when there was no one to ask instead. I thought about that winter. A young woman alone in the plague-dark forest, with nothing but the things her father had taught her and the questions she could remember to ask. Were you afraid? I asked. She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. Yes, she said, but fear it is not the enemy it is made out to be. It pays attention. It notices things. In the borderlands, I learned to treat my fear the way I treat a watchful wolf. Let it speak, hear what it has to say, decide whether the thing it is afraid of is actually dangerous. A pause. Most of the things it was afraid of were not the things worth being afraid of. The cold, the hunger, the solitude, those were survivable. The thing worth being afraid of was the forgetting. Forgetting what? That I had once known what it felt like to be in a room that was warm, she said quietly, and had somewhere to be in the morning. The fire cracked and settled. Lyra in the corner had fallen asleep over her parchment, one cheek pressed against the back of her hand, her charcoal fallen loose between her fingers. I looked at her and then at Saren and I said, "You have that again now." She looked at me. The firelight was on her face, and the openness that had been growing in her features over the weeks was fully there, no longer carefully sealed away. "Yes," she said, "I know." We sat for a while longer, and then I went and carried Lyra to her chamber without waking her, and Saren went to her own room, and the small hall went dark, and the fire burned down to the kind of glow that keeps a room warm for hours after everyone has gone. The end of the fortnight came and went, and Saren was still at Ashenvale. The last of the 40 wolves was cleared on the 14th day, which happened to be a morning of particularly spectacular winter light, the kind that comes when the sun is low, and the snow is fresh, and everything is so bright it seems to have been newly made. I went to the infirmary and found Saren standing in the middle of the ward, now empty of sick wolves and full instead of morning light, and the smell of the sage and pine resin she had burned every day to cleanse the air. She was looking around the room with the expression of a person who has been so focused on a task for so long that the completion of it comes as something slightly disorienting. "Done," I said from the doorway. She turned. "Done," she agreed. I said I would ask properly once they were all cleared. She looked at me, and this time she was not holding herself carefully at a distance. She was simply looking at me, all the way through, with those dark eyes that saw exactly what was in front of them and had no talent for pretending otherwise. "You did say that," she said. "I would like you to stay," I said. "Not as a healer, or not only as a healer if you want to keep working. I would like you to stay here at Ashenvale, and I would like, in time, to give you every reason I know how to give to want to stay. This is not a command, and it is not an arrangement, and if you want an escort south tomorrow, I will provide it without any complaint. I am asking what you want." The silence stretched. It was not a bad silence. It was a thinking silence, the kind that a person who has learned to be careful with wanting things needs before they can allow themselves to want something. "I want to stay," she said. I have been surprised by that. I came here expecting to be sent away, and instead I found—" She stopped and looked at her hands and then at me. "Lyra," she said quietly. "I did not expect Lyra." Something in my chest ached with a tenderness I had no adequate word for. "She found you," I said. "Yes," the pause. "She did." I crossed the infirmary then slowly, because it was that kind of distance, and I stood in front of her, and I took her hand between both of mine the way she had taken Garen's hand on the first day, not to hold it but to hold it, to make the warmth between us a physical, present thing, instead of just something that lived behind my sternum. "Then stay," I said, "as long as you want to stay." She looked down at her hand in mine. The morning light was on her face. She was not crying, but she looked the way a person looks when they have been holding something for a long time and have finally set it down. "All right," she said for the second time. The same two words, but they meant something different now. They meant yes. They meant I am choosing this. They meant I am letting myself want this, which I have not done in a very long time, and I am choosing to anyway. Aldrich found us in the infirmary 10 minutes later. He had, I strongly suspected, been waiting in the corridor. He came in with the portrait face and the parchment, though this time the parchment was a different one. "My king," he said, "the council requests clarity on the healer's status going forward." "She is staying," I said. A pause, as a member of the healer's contingent. "As my guest," I said. "For now, we will discuss the rest in time." Aldrich looked at Saren. Saren looked at Aldrich with the same steady, measuring regard she gave everyone. "Welcome to Ashenvale," Aldrich said, in the tone of a man who has decided to accept a situation he cannot change, and intends to do it with dignity. "Thank you," Saren said. He left. The portrait face, I noticed, had been replaced, by the end, with something closer to his actual face, a drier, quieter expression that was not warmth exactly but was its first cousin. In the weeks that followed, Saren became part of the life of Ashenvale in the way that some people become part of a place without anyone quite deciding that they should. Not loudly, not through position or ceremony, through the accumulation of small, daily presence. She was in the infirmary most mornings, working with Marin, who had the expression of a woman who has found a colleague she had not known she was missing. She walked the fortress grounds in the afternoons, learning the layout of the place, the names of the pack members she had not yet treated, the habits of the wolves who patrolled the outer wall. Lyra followed her through all of it. I watched them together and thought, sometimes, about what my wolf, the deep, quiet presence at the center of me that I rarely allowed to lead and rarely had reason to consult on matters other than pack safety, made of her. It was hard to say. My wolf was not demonstrative in the way that some wolves are. It did not surge or howl or manifest itself visibly, except in the rare moments when the pack needed something I could not provide in human form. What it did, around Saren, was settle. Like a river settling toward the sea. A long, deep, relieved settling, as though it had been straining towards something for a long time and had finally been told it was allowed to stop. I told her this one evening when we were sitting in the great hall after dinner, not the formal great hall with the long tables and the council seats, but the smaller hall at the back of the fortress, the one with the fire and the old chairs and the shelves of maps that I had never finished organizing. It was the room where I actually spent my evenings, as opposed to the room where I spent them officially, and I had started, cautiously, to share it with her. "My wolf settles around you," I said, and then felt immediately that I had expressed this badly. She looked up from the map she had been examining, a detailed one of the borderland settlements, which she had been adding notations to from memory, marking the locations of the other healers she knew of, the supply caches, the safe routes. "Is that unusual?" she asked. "It is unusual for me," I said. "It does not settle easily. It has not settled in a long time." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. "Something in me recognizes this place," she said carefully, as though she was measuring out the words the same way she measured her powders, exactly as much as was needed, no more. "I told myself it was because I was tired, and any warm hall would feel like coming home when you have been sleeping outside for 3 winters. But that is not quite it." A pause. "I feel," she stopped. "What?" "Safe," she said. The word came out quietly, almost surprised, as though she had found it somewhere she had not expected to look. "I did not expect to feel safe again. I had decided it was not a feeling that was going to be available to me anymore." The coal was fire, fully and properly. I set down my cup and looked at her, and she looked back at me, and between us the map lay with its careful notations, and the fire was going, and the hall was warm all the way to the edges. "You are safe here," I said. "I would like you to stay safe here for a long time." She looked at me. The stillness in her face had changed. Over the weeks, it was still there, but it was no longer the stillness of someone holding themselves carefully at a remove from wanting things. It was a different kind of stillness now, the kind that comes after a long time of holding and the slow, deliberate process of letting go. "I think I would like that too," she said. The 3rd week of her presence at Ashenvale, Aldrich came to me with the parchment again. It was, I will admit, my fault for putting him off. I had been enjoying the gradual, unhurried shape of what was forming between us. The evenings in the small hall, the mornings I found her in the courtyard with her hood down looking at the mountains, the dinners where she had begun to speak more freely, telling me about the years in the borderlands, the people she had known there, the things she had seen and done and survived. And I had been, I will admit, slightly afraid of formalizing it, not because I did not know what I wanted, but because formalizing it meant naming it in front of Aldrich and the council, and naming it would make it real in a way that could be contested, and I had a very old instinct, sharpened by loss, to protect the real things from the parts of the world that might damage them. This was a mistake, and Lyra was the one who corrected it. It happened at the morning assembly, which was the one event each week at which the full council sat in the great hall along with the senior pack members. Not a formal ceremony, only an administrative gathering, but it was attended, and it was public, and nothing that happened in it was ever not discussed at length afterward. Saren had not been at the assembly before. She usually spent those mornings in the infirmary. But on this morning, Marin had sent her to retrieve a case of supplies from the storeroom at the far end of the great hall, and Saren had come in through the side door and was crossing quietly along the far wall, not wanting to interrupt. She had almost reached the storeroom when Aldrich, who was speaking from his place at the council table, paused. "My king," he said, loudly enough to carry, "the matter of the healer from Duskfen has remained unresolved for 3 weeks. The council would appreciate at this time." I was about to speak. I had a response prepared, the same careful deferral I had been using, the same promise to consider, because I had not yet decided how to name this formally, and I was still, foolishly, trying to protect the thing from being named before I was ready. I did not get to say it. There was a sound from the far side of the hall. Small feet moving fast across the stone floor. Every head turned. Lyra had been sitting in her usual place at the end of the council table, where she always sat during the assembly, small and still, and usually engaged in drawing on whatever scraps of parchment she could find among the council papers. But she was no longer sitting. She was on her feet, and she was moving towards Saren with a directness and urgency that I had not seen in her since before her mother died, a 3 years ago directness, the directness of a child who has made a decision and intends to honor it. The hall had gone quiet. Saren had stopped in the middle of the room, her case of supplies held against her chest, watching Lyra come. Lyra reached her. She looked up at Saren, and Saren looked down at her, and the whole hall was absolutely silent. Lyra put her hand in Saren's hand. And then, in a voice that I had not heard in 2 years and 9 months, a voice that was slightly rougher with disuse than it had once been but was unmistakably, heartbreakingly hers, high and clear and absolutely certain, she said one word. Saren. Only that. Her name. But the way she said it was not the way you say a name when you are introducing someone. It was the way you say a name when you have found the person you were looking for after a long time of looking, and want the whole world to know that you have found them. The hall went still in a different way than it had been still before. I was standing at the head of the council table, and I felt the mate mark before I saw it, a deep, blazing warmth that began at my left wrist and radiated outward, up my arm, through my chest, reaching the coal that had been burning there since the first night in the courtyard and meeting it, igniting it fully so that I understood all at once and completely what it was and what it had always been. I looked down. The mark was on my wrist, glowing the soft, deep gold of firelight, the crescent-tanned wolf head that was the mate mark of the Ashenvale line, the mark I had carried since I came into my full strength, and that had never, not once in 10 years, responded to anyone. It was blazing now. I looked across the hall at Saren. She was looking at her own wrist, where the same mark was blazing in the same deep gold and exact mirror. Her lips were parted. She looked not frightened but stunned, and behind the shock was something else, something that I recognized because it was what I felt too. The breathless, unfamiliar sensation of a thing you stopped hoping for arriving anyway. The hall was completely still. 40 wolves, the full council, Aldrich at his table with his portrait face in the process of becoming something it had never been before, which was a face that has just understood that it was wrong. I stepped down from the dais. I walked the length of the hall not quickly, because this was not a thing to rush, but steadily, because I had known for 3 weeks that I was walking toward this, and I was not going to pretend otherwise in front of my pack. I stopped in front of her. She looked up at me. Her eyes were very bright. The mark on her wrist was still blazing, and mine was answering it, and between us Lyra was still holding Saren's hand and looking at both of us with the particular expression of a child who has done a thing and knows that she has done it well. She chose you first, I said. A breath she did. I held up my wrist, the mark blazing. The mark chose you next. She held up hers. Yes. And I said, chose you before either of them, in a courtyard in the snow when you said you had stopped hoping to feel safe anywhere, and I decided then that I would give you every reason I had to feel safe here. I looked at her. All I am asking, all I have ever been asking, is whether you will let me. The stillness in her face did something I had not seen it do before. It broke, just slightly, the way ice breaks in early spring, not shattering, just releasing, the first crack that lets you know the season has turned. You great foolish man, she said very softly, and she was half laughing, the edge of it catching in her throat. I decided that in the infirmary on the 3rd night, when you came and sat in the doorway and didn't say anything, and I thought, this is a man who knows how to be present without taking up all the air. I blinked, of all the things she might have said. You could have told me, I said. I was being careful. You could have been careful and also told me. You could have asked. I was asking, I said, as clearly as I know how. She looked at me still with the cracked ice expression, warm now all the way through. Yes, she said, I know I am saying yes. Behind me, in the hall, someone let out a breath they had been holding. And then someone else did, and then the whole pack was breathing again, and the silence became, gently, the kind of sound a hall makes when it is filling with warmth, low voices, the shift of feet, the creak of a chair. I took her hand, not the marked hand, her other hand, the one that had held Garen's when he was afraid and the small hem of Lyra's apron the first morning, the hand that had been given to everyone who needed it. I held it and I looked at Aldrich. He was still at the council table. The portrait face was gone. What was there instead was older and quieter, and if I had to name it, I would call it the face of a man who has been corrected by something larger than himself, and has the decency to know it. He inclined his head, a small movement precise. "My king," he said, "and nothing else." And from Lyra, still holding Saren's other hand, still looking up at both of us with the accomplished expression of a child who has done a thing she knew was right and has been proven correct, came the sound of laughter. Not much of it, just a little, bright and sudden and rougher with disuse than it had once been, but hers, entirely hers, returning to the room like a light that had been off for a long time and was finally, gently, switched back on. That was the moment, not the mark blazing, not the long walk down the hall. That was the moment I remember when I think about the morning Saren came to Ashenvale out of the snow and cold, expected to be turned away, and was not. Lyra's laugh coming back. The rest of it, the formal arrangements, the ceremony in the Moon Hall 3 weeks later, the day that Aldrich, in his careful, precise way, wrote a new document and placed it on my desk with the heading *Saren of Ashenvale, First Luna. All of that came after, and all of it mattered. But it was the laugh I kept. We have been bound for 2 years now, and in those 2 years the second outbreak has been fully contained. The last settlement cleared in the spring after Saren mapped the remaining cases and coordinated the borderland healers with a thoroughness that made Marin say, privately, that she wished we had hired her 3 years earlier. The infirmary at Ashenvale is twice the size it was. She has trained 4 new healers, all of them young, all of them capable, all of them working with the symbols she invented for her packets, the circle and the star and the crescent, as though they are the most natural shorthand in the world. Lyra speaks now. She has been speaking since the morning in the great hall, first in short, careful sentences, then in longer ones, then in the rushing, slightly ahead of herself way that she used to speak when she was small before. She and Saren have a habit of talking to each other while they work, Saren measuring, Lyra handing her things, both of them carrying on a continuous, overlapping conversation about the natural world. What bird made that sound? What herb is that growing along the south wall? Why do the wolves gather at the east gate on cold mornings? Lyra has a talent for questions. Saren has the patience to answer them fully and the wisdom to give back the ones she can't answer with a, "What do you think?" That treats the question as a serious one. Aldrich does not say ill omen anymore. He says the first Luna with the careful precision of a man who has decided that if a thing is true, it should be said exactly. And I, who had believed for 3 years that the coal in my chest was dead, who had carried it so long without noticing it that I had forgotten it was anything other than absence. I live now in a room that is warm all the way to the edges. She asked me once whether I thought she had been sent to Ashenvale or whether she had simply arrived. A question about fate, about whether the mark on her wrist had been drawing her here since before she knew what it was. I thought about that for a moment, about the cold courtyard and the snow and the gatekeepers and the slight, mud-colored figure who had been standing in it expecting to be turned away. "I think," I said, "that you chose every single step that brought you here, and that the mark was waiting because it knew you would." She considered this. "That is either the most romantic thing you have said," she said, "or the most logically inconsistent. Can it not be both?" She looked at me with those dark eyes that see exactly what is in front of them. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it can." The snow was falling outside, the same slow, sideways snow it had been falling when she first arrived, and Lyra was in the corner with her parchment and her charcoal, drawing something with the focused concentration she brought to everything she cared about, and the fire was going, and the small hall was warm, and Saren was here. She was here. That was everything.